Have you ever wondered what a human being becomes when every single thing they love is stripped away? Not gradually, not with warning, but in one brutal moment that shatters their entire world. What happens when a man who's spent 18 years perfecting his craft, building trust, playing the role of the obedient slave, suddenly has nothing left to lose? Tonight, I'm going to tell you about Marcus Wellington, a 38-year-old enslaved cook in South Carolina who turned his kitchen into a chamber of death and poisoned 12 white people at a harvest feast in 1847. This isn't a story about random violence. This is a story about calculated revenge, about a brilliant mind pushed beyond its breaking point, about justice served on fine china with silver utensils. And what makes this story truly terrifying for the slaveholders of the time wasn't just what Marcus did, but how he did it. With patience, with precision, with such meticulous planning that by the time they realized what was happening, it was already far too late to save anyone. Marcus Wellington was born free in 1809 in a small village in what is now Nigeria, part of the Yoruba people. His mother was a healer, one of those remarkable women who understood plants and their properties, who could cure fever with roots and ease pain with carefully prepared teas. She taught young Marcus everything she knew, walking with him through forests, showing him which leaves could heal and which could kill, explaining that knowledge was power, especially knowledge that others didn't possess. His father was a trader, traveling between villages, exchanging goods, building relationships. Marcus learned from him too, learned how to read people, how to gain trust, how to make yourself indispensable so that others needed you alive and well. But in 1813, when Marcus was just 5 years old, British slavers came. They didn't raid his specific village, but they bought him from raiders who had, men from rival tribes who saw profit in war and betrayal. Marcus's mother fought them, using the only weapon she had, a cooking knife. She managed to wound 2 of them before a musket ball ended her life. His father was away trading, never knowing what happened to his family. Marcus was small, young, easily controlled, valuable cargo for the slave ships that prowled the West African coast, looking for human merchandise. The Middle Passage took 9 weeks. Marcus was packed into the hold of a ship called Providence, which was a cruel joke considering there was no providence for the 387 people chained in darkness, filth, and despair. Children fared slightly better than adults in one respect. They were small enough to be kept on slightly higher shelves in the slave deck, which meant marginally more air. But that marginal improvement meant nothing when disease swept through the hold. By the time the ship reached Charleston, South Carolina, 142 of the 387 had died and been thrown overboard. At the Charleston slave market, a wealthy plantation, owner named Robert Blackwater, father of Edwin, purchased young Marcus for $250. Robert saw potential in the intelligent, watchful child who somehow maintained dignity, even standing on an auction block. Robert didn't need another field hand. He had 60 of those already, but he needed someone to train for household service, someone young enough to mold, smart enough to learn, and broken enough to obey. For the first 8 years, Marcus worked as a house servant at Blackwater Plantation in Charleston County, South Carolina. He cleaned, he fetched, he carried, he learned English with surprising speed, and he watched everything. He watched how white people lived, how they thought, how they justified owning other humans. And he never forgot what his mother had taught him about plants, about poisons, about the thin line between medicine and murder. When Marcus was 13, the plantation's head cook, an elderly enslaved woman named Aunt Betty, took him under her wing. She was 68 years old, had been cooking for the Blackwater family for 40 years, and had created a culinary reputation that extended throughout Charleston County. When the Blackwaters hosted dinners, which they did frequently, other plantation owners would comment enviously on the quality of the food. Aunt Betty taught Marcus everything she knew about cooking: how to prepare game, how to make sauces, how to bake bread, how to create elaborate desserts that impressed white guests. But she also taught him something more valuable: how to be indispensable. "They won't sell you if they need you," she would say while kneading dough. "Make yourself so valuable they can't imagine running the house without you. That's your only protection in this world." Marcus learned those lessons well. By the time he was 18, he was the best cook in Charleston County, and he knew it. He could prepare French cuisine, traditional English meals, and incorporate African and Caribbean spices in ways that delighted the white palate. Master Robert Blackwater boasted about his cook at every social gathering, often bringing Marcus out to receive compliments from guests, displaying him like a prized possession. And Marcus played the role perfectly. He smiled, he bowed, he said, "Yes, master, and thank you, sir," with apparent sincerity. He made himself indispensable. He made them trust him. And all the while he was studying them, learning their habits, their preferences, their vulnerabilities. When Robert Blackwater died in 1835, his son Edwin inherited everything: the plantation, the 78 slaves, the debts, and the reputation. Edwin was 25 years old, educated at the College of Charleston, handsome in the way wealthy Southern men were handsome, with carefully trimmed facial hair, expensive clothes, and the casual cruelty that came from never having been denied anything in his life. Edwin Blackwater stood about 5'10", with a stocky build that was beginning to turn soft from too much rich food and bourbon. His face was round, with small, calculating eyes, a weak chin hidden by a beard, and lips that seemed perpetually curled in disdain. He wore his brown hair slicked back with pomade, and his hands, soft and unmarked by labor, were decorated with 3 gold rings. But those soft hands could inflict terrible violence when he felt disrespected or disobeyed. Edwin believed in the racial theories popular among Charleston's elite, that slavery was ordained by God, that Africans were naturally inferior, that the plantation system was not just economically necessary, but morally correct. This belief structure allowed him to sleep soundly after ordering horrific punishments, to enjoy elaborate meals prepared by enslaved hands, to rape enslaved women without conscience, and to separate families without guilt. His wife, Catherine Blackwater, was 31 years old when Marcus's story reaches its critical point in 1847. She was the daughter of a prominent Charleston merchant family that had made their fortune in the slave trade itself, literally buying and selling human beings by the thousands. Catherine was petite, barely 5'2". With pale skin she protected obsessively from the sun. Blonde hair she wore in elaborate curls, and ice-blue eyes that could turn cold as winter when displeased. Catherine ruled the household slaves with capricious tyranny that was somehow worse than Edwin's more straightforward brutality. Edwin would order a whipping for a specific infraction and then forget about it. Catherine would punish slaves for imagined slights, for perceived incompetence, for simply being nearby when she was in a foul mood. Her favorite punishment was burns. She would heat a fireplace poker until it glowed red, then press it against the flesh of whoever had displeased her. The household slaves all bore her marks, small circular scars on arms, backs, and legs that served as permanent reminders of her power. The Blackwaters had one son, Edmund, who was 24 in 1847. Edmund had inherited his father's sense of entitlement and his mother's cruelty, but lacked even their minimal restraint. He was tall, about 6'1", with his mother's blonde hair and his father's stocky build. He had cold gray eyes and a cruel mouth, and he took particular pleasure in the suffering of others. Edmund regularly raped enslaved women, sometimes in the slave quarters, sometimes bringing them to his room in the main house, exercising the privilege that slavery granted to white men without consequences. The overseer, Vincent Cross, was not a South Carolinian by birth, but a Virginian who had drifted south following opportunities to inflict violence for profit. He was 50 years old in 1847, built like a bull, short but massively muscled from decades of physical labor and violence. His face was scarred from smallpox, his nose had been broken multiple times, and his hands were permanently stained from handling the bullwhip he carried everywhere. Cross was a professional in the business of terror. He kept meticulous records of every punishment he administered, noting the date, the infraction, the number of lashes, and the result. By 1847, he had personally delivered over 15,000 lashes to enslaved people across 3 different plantations. He spoke of this number with pride, as other men might boast about business successes or military victories. Then there were the 4 drivers, enslaved men promoted to supervisory positions over their fellow bondsmen. Josiah, 49, had been a driver for 15 years. Peter, 44, was known for his particularly harsh treatment of other slaves. Samuel, 38, same age as Marcus, and the two had a complicated history of former friendship turned bitter by Samuel's collaboration. And Matthew, 31, the youngest, most desperate to prove his loyalty through extra cruelty. Blackwater Plantation sprawled across 920 acres of prime cotton land in Charleston County, about 15 miles north of the city itself. The year 1847 was an excellent year for cotton prices, with the growing textile mills in England creating insatiable demand. A 500-pound bale of clean cotton could fetch $45 at the Charleston markets, and Blackwater Plantation produced approximately 180 bales per year, generating gross revenue of over $8,000 annually. The plantation's main house was a magnificent 3-story structure built in the Greek Revival style with 6 massive white columns supporting a grand portico. Inside, the house featured 14 rooms, each decorated with expensive furniture, paintings, and crystal chandeliers imported from Europe. The wealth extracted from enslaved labor had been converted into visible luxury that impressed visitors and reinforced the Blackwater family's social standing. Behind the main house stood the separate kitchen building, a necessary feature in Southern architecture because cooking fires posed constant danger to wooden structures. This kitchen was Marcus's domain, a 30-foot by 25-foot building with a massive fireplace, brick ovens, a large preparation table, shelves holding hundreds of ingredients and spices, and racks of copper pots and pans. The kitchen had 2 windows for ventilation and a door that could be barred from inside, though no one thought a slave would need to lock himself in. Further back, beyond the carefully maintained gardens and decorative spaces, sat the slave quarters, 26 cabins arranged in 3 rows, each cabin measuring 18 feet by 16 feet, housing anywhere from 4 to 7 people, depending on family size. The cabins had dirt floors, no glass windows, only wooden shutters, and fireplaces that drew smoke poorly, creating a constant haze during winter months. Marcus lived in one of these cabins with Sarah, his wife of 15 years, and their 2 children, Grace, age 9, and Thomas, age 6. Sarah was 32 years old in 1847, born on Blackwater Plantation as her mother had been before her. She worked in the cotton fields, her hands permanently stained from handling the sticky bowls, her back bent from years of labor under the brutal South. Carolina's son. Sarah was beautiful, despite the hardship etched into her young face, tall and strong, with intelligent eyes, high cheekbones, and a smile that could transform her entire appearance when she allowed herself to show it, which was rare. Marcus had fallen in love with her at a corn shucking when he was 20 and she was 14, though they hadn't been allowed to marry until she was 17 and he was 23. Master Edwin had to give permission, and he only granted it because Marcus was valuable and happy slaves were more productive slaves. Grace was already showing signs of her father's intelligence, quick to learn, observant, careful. She helped in the main house under Catherine Blackwater's supervision, cleaning, polishing silver, and performing small tasks. Thomas was still young enough to play, though even at 6 he was expected to carry water, to field hands and perform simple errands. The family's life followed the brutal rhythms of slavery. Work from dawn until dusk, minimal food, constant fear, and the vigilance required to survive in a system designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimal sustenance. Breakfast was hominy grits and sometimes a small piece of salt pork, if they were fortunate. Dinner was the same, more grits, some vegetables from their small garden plot if the season was right, occasionally a chicken if they managed to raise one without it being confiscated. But there were moments of grace carved out of brutal existence. On Sunday afternoons, when work stopped, at noon by law, enslaved families would gather. The men would hunt or fish. The women would cook communal meals. Children would play games passed down through generations. And at night, they would hold secret religious meetings in the woods, hush harbors, where they could worship without white supervision, sing spirituals carrying coded messages of hope and resistance, and maintain dignity as human beings created in God's image, regardless of what the law said about their legal status as property. Marcus cherished these Sundays with his family. He would teach Grace about cooking, showing her how to identify different spices by smell, how to judge when meat was perfectly cooked, how to create dishes that pleased even the most demanding palate. With Thomas, he would carve small wooden animals, tell stories about Africa that his own mother had told him before she died, tales of Anansi the spider and his clever tricks, stories about a time when their people had been free. Sarah would watch these moments with fierce love in her eyes, memorizing every detail against the constant threat that haunted every enslaved family: separation. Because in South Carolina in 1847, love was an act of defiance. Building a family, nurturing children, creating bonds of affection, all of this contradicted the fundamental premise of slavery, which required that enslaved people be property rather than people, commodities rather than family members. Marcus understood the precariousness of his position better than most. Yes, he was valuable. Yes, the Blackwaters depended on his cooking skills. Yes, he had relative privilege compared to field hands, who labored under the overseer's whip from dawn to dusk. But he also knew that economic necessity could override any consideration for enslaved families. He had seen it happen dozens of times. A planter facing debt would sell slaves to raise cash, breaking up families without hesitation or guilt. So Marcus lived with constant low-grade terror, hidden beneath his mask of competent servitude. He played his role perfectly, smiling at Master Edwin's jokes, accepting compliments from dinner guests, preparing elaborate meals that enhanced the Blackwater family's reputation, and all the while, he was preparing for the possibility that his worst fear would come true. He saved money when he could, pennies and dollars collected over years from the small gifts guests sometimes gave him after particularly excellent meals. He hid this money in a leather pouch beneath the floorboards of the kitchen, hoping that someday he might accumulate enough to purchase his family's freedom, though he knew the amount required, probably $3,000 for all 4 of them, was impossibly beyond reach. He also maintained his knowledge of plants and their properties, that education his mother had given him before she died. In the forests around Blackwater Plantation grew dozens of plants with medicinal properties, and dozens more with toxic ones. Marcus would walk through these woods on Sunday afternoons, ostensibly hunting for mushrooms and herbs to enhance his cooking, but actually cataloging every poisonous plant he encountered. Oleander, beautiful flowering shrubs planted around the main house for decoration, every part of the plant deadly toxic. Water hemlock, growing in marshy areas, one bite of the root could kill a grown man in 15 minutes. Belladonna, beautiful lady, containing atropine that could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Foxglove, with its beautiful purple flowers, containing digitalis that could stop a heart. Castor beans, from which ricin could be extracted, one of the most potent toxins known. Marcus studied these plants with academic interest, learning their properties, their effects, their dosages. He told himself it was simply intellectual curiosity, simply maintaining knowledge his mother had passed down. But deep in his heart, he knew he was preparing for something. He didn't know what or when, but he was preparing. The catalyzing event came on January 15th, 1847, a cold Thursday that Marcus would remember for the rest of his short life. Master Edwin's cotton speculation had gone badly wrong. He had borrowed heavily to purchase additional land, expecting cotton prices to rise even higher. Instead, a bumper crop in 1846 had flooded the market, and prices had fallen 30%. By January 1847, Edwin owed $6,000 to various creditors, a staggering sum that threatened foreclosure on the plantation itself. Desperate men make desperate decisions. Edwin decided to sell slaves to raise the necessary cash, and a slave trader named James Rutherford had arrived at Blackwater Plantation 3 days earlier with $2,000 to spend on prime field hands and potentially valuable domestic slaves. Marcus was in the kitchen preparing lunch when Peter, one of the drivers, came running. "Marcus," Peter said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Master Edwin selling Sarah and the children. They loading them in the wagon right now. You got to come." Everything stopped. The knife Marcus had been using to cut vegetables fell from his hand, clattering on the preparation table. The world seemed to tilt sideways. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what Peter had just said. Then he was running, bursting out of the kitchen, sprinting across the carefully manicured grounds toward the main house where a wagon waited. And there they were, his entire world being loaded into a slave trader's wagon. Sarah stood with her hands bound behind her back, her face wet with tears, but her spine straight, refusing to collapse even now. Grace sobbed uncontrollably, her small body shaking. Thomas screamed for his father, his voice breaking with terror. "Master Edwin." Marcus's voice cracked as he fell to his knees before his owner, who stood on the portico watching the scene with the mild annoyance of a man dealing with an inconvenient business transaction. "Please, Master Edwin, please. I'll work harder. I'll give you everything I've saved. Please don't take my family. Please, sir. I'm begging you." Edwin looked down at the kneeling man with the expression one might give a dog that had soiled the carpet. "Get up, Marcus. Your feelings are understandable but irrelevant. I need $2,000, and Rutherford is paying exactly that for your wife and children. It's simple mathematics. I'll earn it, master. Give me time. I'll cook for other plantations. I'll give you every penny." "You'll do what I tell you when I tell you because you are my property," Edwin interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade. "Your opinions on the matter are of no consequence. Now get back to the kitchen. We have dinner guests tonight, and I expect the meal to be perfect." This emotional display is unseemly. Marcus crawled forward on his knees, abandoning all pride in desperate bargaining. "Master, I'm begging you. They're my family, my children. Please, master, have mercy." Edwin kicked him in the face, not particularly hard, just enough to make his point. Marcus's nose broke with a sharp crack, blood pouring down his face, soaking his shirt. "You don't have a family, Marcus. You have breeding stock that I allowed you to rut with, and now I'm selling that stock because I need the money." Cross. Vincent Cross appeared, bullwhip already in hand. "Yes, master." "Give this uppity Negro 5 lashes for forgetting his place. Do it right here so his whelps can watch." They stripped Marcus's shirt and tied his hands to the iron ring mounted in the portico column, the same ring used for all plantation whippings. Vincent Cross stepped back, unfurling his whip with practiced ease. The first lash cut across Marcus's back like liquid fire. He didn't scream. He bit his tongue hard enough to taste copper and stared at Sarah, willing her to see that he was strong, that he could endure this. The second lash crossed the first, forming an X of torn flesh. Blood began flowing down his back. Still, he didn't scream. Third lash. Fourth. Fifth. Each one carving permanent marks into his flesh, each one witnessed by his wife and children as they were loaded into the wagon. They untied him, and he collapsed, unable to stand. Through pain-blurred vision, he watched James Rutherford climb onto the wagon seat and take up the reins. "Please," Marcus whispered, the word barely audible. Sarah's voice rang out clear and strong despite her tears. "Marcus, I love you. I will always love you. Live. Promise me you'll live." "Papa!" Thomas's scream tore through the air. "Papa, help us!" Grace fought her bond so violently she tore the skin on her wrists. "I love you, Papa." The wagon began moving. Marcus lay in his own blood and watched the wagon disappear down the drive, carrying his family away forever. Something fundamental crystallized inside him in that moment. Not broke, crystallized. Hardened. Transformed from soft human feeling into something cold and sharp and utterly focused. Marcus dragged himself to his feet, blood still flowing from the lash marks on his back and from his broken nose. He didn't go to the slave hospital where the elderly woman who served as nurse might clean and bind his wounds. He went directly to his kitchen, closed the door, and stood in the center of the space that had been his domain for 18 years. For a long time he simply stood there, dripping blood onto the wooden floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then slowly, he walked to the preparation table and picked up the knife he had dropped when Peter brought the news. He held it, feeling its familiar weight, and remembered his mother's final words as the slavers dragged them apart. "Knowledge is power, my son. Never forget what I taught you." The time had come to use that knowledge. Marcus walked to the shelves where he kept his herbs and spices, hundreds of ingredients collected over nearly 2 decades of cooking. Hidden behind the common items, salt, pepper, thyme, sage, were other substances. Dried oleander leaves, carefully preserved. Powdered castor beans. Belladonna extract in a small dark bottle. Foxglove, dried and ground. Water hemlock root, sealed in wax to preserve its potency. He had been collecting these for years, telling himself it was simply maintaining his mother's teachings, simply preserving knowledge. But now he understood. He had been preparing for exactly this moment, for the day when everything was taken from him, and revenge became the only form of justice available. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He sat in his empty cabin, the absence of Sarah and the children a physical weight crushing his chest, and made his plans. Not impulsive plans born of rage, but careful, methodical calculations that accounted for every variable, every risk, every contingency. He knew the Blackwater family's eating habits intimately. Edwin took his breakfast at 8 or 2 a.m. sharp, eggs, bacon, biscuits, coffee. Catherine breakfasted at 9, usually just tea and toast unless there were guests. Edmund rarely appeared before noon, usually hungover from the previous night's drinking. They all came together for dinner at 7 p.m., the main meal of the day, when Marcus was expected to produce multiple courses that demonstrated his skill and enhanced the family's reputation. He knew that late September was the traditional time for the harvest feast, when neighboring plantation owners and their families would gather to celebrate another year of profits extracted from stolen labor. The feast always lasted 3 days, with dozens of guests, elaborate meals, free-flowing bourbon, and the facade of refined Southern culture built on foundations of brutality. 8 months. He had 8 months until the harvest feast. 8 months to prepare the most elaborate meal of his career. 8 months to perfect his plan. The next morning, Marcus appeared in the kitchen at 5 a.m. as always. His back was a ruin of torn flesh and dried blood, his nose swollen and crooked, his eyes red from a sleepless night. But he prepared breakfast perfectly. Eggs cooked exactly as Master Edwin liked them, bacon crisp but not burnt, biscuits light and fluffy. When Edwin came down to breakfast, he glanced at Marcus with mild surprise. "You look terrible, but the food is acceptable. See that you maintain standards despite your personal drama. I'm hosting the Middleton family for dinner tonight. Prepare something impressive." "Yes, master," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Of course, master." That night, Marcus prepared roasted duck with cherry sauce, sweet potato soufflé, green beans with almonds, and pecan pie. The Middletons praised the meal enthusiastically. Master Edwin beamed with pride, never noticing the way Marcus studied each guest, calculating, planning, adding names to a mental list. Over the following months, Marcus became the perfect slave, more perfect than he had ever been before. He anticipated needs before they were expressed. He prepared meals that exceeded expectations. He smiled, bowed, said, "Yes, master," and "Thank you, sir," with apparent sincerity that hid the cold calculation beneath. And slowly, carefully, he began his preparations. He collected poisons with methodical patience. Sunday walks in the woods yielded oleander flowers, water hemlock roots, foxglove leaves. He dried them carefully in the rafters of the kitchen where no one would notice. He extracted oils and essences, using techniques his mother had taught him decades ago in Africa. He tested dosages on the plantation's rats, noting how much was needed to kill quickly versus how much would cause a slower, more agonizing death. Marcus also studied the upcoming harvest feast with obsessive attention. He learned who would be attending, Master Edwin and Catherine, of course, Edmund, their son, Vincent Cross, the overseer, the 4 drivers, Josiah, Peter, Samuel, and Matthew, James Rutherford, the slave trader who had bought his family. Master Edwin had invited him as a gesture of continuing business relationship, promising him first pick of any slaves to be sold after the harvest. And guests from neighboring plantations, the Middleton family, the Ravenels, the Pringles. Over 40 white people in total, the cream of Charleston County society, gathering to celebrate their wealth and refinement while the people who created that wealth slept in dirt floor cabins and ate scraps. Marcus decided he would kill 12 of them. Not all, that would be impossible, but 12 specific targets who had caused him direct harm or who represented the system that had destroyed his family. The primary targets: Edwin, Catherine, and Edwin Blackwater, the family who owned him, who had sold his wife and children, who had whipped him for begging for mercy. Vincent Cross, the overseer, who had delivered thousands of lashes, who had broken bodies and spirits for profit. The 4 drivers, Josiah, Peter, Samuel, and Matthew, men who had chosen collaboration over solidarity, who had inflicted suffering on their own people in exchange for marginal privileges. James Rutherford, the slave trader who had bought Sarah, Grace, and Thomas and driven them away in chains. And 3 guests, Colonel Richard Middleton, known throughout the county for his savage punishments, Henry Ravenel, who had recently burned a slave alive for attempting escape, and Dr. Thomas Pringle, who conducted medical experiments on enslaved people without anesthesia. 12 men, 12 carefully calculated deaths. Marcus's plan was elegant in its simplicity. The harvest feast featured a traditional centerpiece dish, roasted pig, prepared whole, and served as the dramatic culmination of the main dinner. Marcus would prepare this pig with meticulous care, basting it with a sauce that contained precisely calibrated amounts of multiple poisons. Not enough to kill instantly. That would be too obvious, too easy to trace, but enough to cause severe symptoms that would begin several hours after the meal, when guests had retired to their rooms or departed for home. The symptoms would mimic cholera or food poisoning, common enough that initial suspicions wouldn't fall on deliberate poisoning. But Marcus's poisons were special. The combination he had developed would cause progressive organ failure over 3 to 4 days. Victims would experience initial nausea and vomiting, then escalating pain, convulsions, delirium, and finally death. It would be agonizing. It would be slow, and it would give each victim time to understand they were dying, time to fear, time to suffer, as Sarah, Grace, and Thomas were suffering on some cotton plantation in Alabama. He tested his formula carefully on the plantation's livestock, on chickens and pigs, noting the progression of symptoms, adjusting ratios of belladonna to foxglove to water hemlock. He calculated human dosages based on body weight, factoring in that the poison would be diluted by the other foods consumed during the feast. Marcus also planned his alibi. He would eat from the same pig, but from a section he had not treated with poison. He would become mildly ill, enough to deflect suspicion, but not seriously harmed. And he would prepare additional dishes without poison, ensuring that women and children who attended the feast would not be affected. His quarrel was not with them, only with the men who maintained the system through active violence. Do you understand the level of intelligence this required? Marcus was not an educated man by white standards. Slaves were forbidden by law from learning to read or write. But he possessed sophisticated knowledge of chemistry, pharmacology, and human physiology, all learned through oral tradition and personal experimentation. This was the kind of brilliance that slavery tried to suppress, the capabilities that threatened the entire system's justification. The months passed. Spring became summer. The cotton grew tall and white. Master Edwin continued his habits, oblivious to the fact that his trusted cook was planning to poison him. Catherine continued her cruelty, recently burning a house slave with a hot iron for serving tea at the wrong temperature. Edmund continued raping enslaved women, most recently a 16-year-old girl named Lily, who now carried his child. Vincent Cross continued administering whippings with mechanical efficiency, and the 4 drivers continued their collaboration, enforcing the overseer's orders on their fellow slaves. Marcus watched it all with cold eyes and took careful notes in his memory. Every cruelty, every violence, every casual degradation, he was building his case, prosecuting the Blackwater plantation in the court of his own judgment. And the verdict was already decided. Guilty, all of them, sentenced to death. He also maintained contact with the slave community's information network. Through whispered conversations in the quarters, through messages passed by slaves traveling between plantations, he learned about Sarah, Grace, and Thomas. They had been sold to a cotton plantation outside Montgomery, Alabama, owned by a man named Thurston, who was known for working his slaves literally to death, replacing them with new purchases every few years as attrition took its toll. Sarah was in the fields from dawn to dusk, picking cotton under the whip. Grace, at 9 years old, was also in the fields, her small hands bleeding from the sharp cotton bolls. Thomas, at 6, was too young for field work, but was used as a water carrier, lugging heavy buckets in the brutal Alabama heat. Every piece of information Marcus received hardened his resolve. His family was suffering. They were being worked to death in the Alabama sun, and the people responsible were eating fine meals, drinking expensive bourbon, sleeping in soft beds, and planning to continue the same practices forever. Not forever. Until September 27th, 1847. That was the day Marcus had chosen for the harvest feast, the day when justice would be served on fine china with silver utensils. By September 1st, everything was ready. Marcus had accumulated sufficient poison, carefully measured into 12 doses. He had tested his cooking procedures multiple times on animal meat, ensuring the poison would distribute evenly through the basting process without affecting the meat's flavor or appearance. He had planned his timing to the minute. He had also identified an accomplice, though the man didn't know it yet. Isaac was a field hand, 45 years old, who had lost his own wife and 2 daughters to the auction block 3 years earlier. Isaac was known for his strength. He could load a cotton bale by himself, and for his barely controlled rage. On September 20th, 1 week before the harvest feast, Marcus approached Isaac in the fields during the brief midday break. "I need to talk to you," Marcus said quietly. "Tonight, After midnight, the old cotton barn. Isaac looked at him with sharp intelligence. This about what I think it's about? Probably. Then I'll be there. That night, in the abandoned cotton barn that smelled of old lint and decay, Marcus laid out his plan. He spoke for 20 minutes, explaining every detail, every contingency. Isaac listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Isaac was quiet for a long time. Then he asked the only question that mattered. How many? 12. You sure you can do 12? With your help, yes. What you need from me? Distraction. On the night of the feast, I need you to start a small fire in the far tobacco barn around 8 p.m., right when dinner is being served. Nothing big, nothing that will spread, just enough smoke to draw attention away from the main house for 15 minutes. That's when I'll be doing the final preparation of the main course. Isaac nodded slowly. And after? They going to hunt us like dogs. You know that. I'm not running. I'm staying right here until they take me. I want them to know who did it. I want every slave in South Carolina to know that Marcus Wellington poisoned 12 white men and went to his death without apology. You going to hang? I know. Worth it. Marcus thought of Sarah's face as the wagon carried her away. He thought of Grace sobbing, of Thomas screaming for his papa. He thought of the 18 years he had spent perfecting his craft, building trust, playing the obedient slave, only to have everything destroyed in a single moment of economic expediency. Yes, he said, it's worth it. They shook hands, sealing the pact. The harvest feast began on September 25th, 2 days before the main dinner. Guests started arriving in elegant carriages, bringing their personal slaves, their fancy clothes, their expectations of refined hospitality. The Blackwater Plantation grounds transformed into a showcase of Southern elegance. Carefully manicured gardens, tables laden with flowers, enslaved musicians playing soft background music. Marcus watched it all from his kitchen and felt nothing but cold calculation. He prepared elaborate meals for the preliminary dinners, each one exceeding the guests' expectations, each one building toward the main event on September 27th. Colonel Richard Middleton arrived with his wife and 3 adult children. Henry Ravenel came with his family and his reputation for savage cruelty. Dr. Thomas Pringle brought his medical bag, perhaps hoping to discuss his latest experiments on enslaved bodies. And James Rutherford, the slave trader, arrived on the afternoon of September 26th, bringing with him 4 newly purchased slaves he was transporting to Georgia. Master Edwin greeted him warmly, already drunk, promising him excellent selections from the upcoming sale of surplus slaves. Marcus watched Rutherford from his kitchen window and felt his hands shake with rage so intense it was almost overwhelming. This was the man who had taken his family. This man was breathing, laughing, drinking bourbon, making plans to destroy more families. Not for much longer. September 27th, 1847 dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for the harvest feast. Marcus woke at 4:00 a.m. in his empty cabin, the absence of Sarah and the children still a physical ache in his chest. He dressed carefully, putting on his cleanest shirt and pants, preparing himself for what would be both his masterpiece and his final act. He walked to the kitchen through the pre-dawn darkness and began his preparations. The pig had been slaughtered the previous day, a massive 200-pound hog that would feed 50 people easily. It hung in the smokehouse, already cleaned and prepared. Marcus retrieved it and began the elaborate process of seasoning and preparing it for roasting. First, the dry rub, salt, black pepper, garlic powder, paprika, brown sugar. He massaged this into every inch of the pig's skin, working with the meticulous care that had made him famous throughout Charleston County. This part was genuine craftsmanship, untainted by poison. The rub would create a beautiful crispy skin that would make guests exclaim with delight. Then came the injection marinade, apple cider, bourbon, molasses, and spices. Marcus used a large syringe to inject this mixture deep into the meat, ensuring flavor penetration throughout. Again, this was pure cooking skill, the foundation that would make the final dish extraordinary. The pig went onto the massive roasting spit at 6 a.m. It would cook slowly over hickory wood for 13 hours, rotating constantly, basted every 30 minutes. This basting was where Marcus's true work would happen. He prepared 2 basting sauces. The first was legitimate: vinegar, more bourbon, butter, spices. This would be used for the first 8 hours, building layers of flavor, creating the foundation of what would be remembered as the finest roasted pig ever served in Charleston County. The second sauce, prepared in a separate pot that Marcus kept carefully isolated, contained his poisons. He had calculated the dosages with obsessive precision: belladonna extract for its effects on the nervous system, confusion, hallucinations, racing heart; foxglove for its cardiac effects, irregular heartbeat, eventual heart failure; water hemlock for its brutal assault on the digestive system, vomiting, seizures, respiratory paralysis; and a touch of arsenic stolen over months from rat poison stored in the Plantation warehouse for its cumulative toxic effects. The combination was diabolical. Initial symptoms would begin 3 to 4 hours after consumption: nausea, dizziness, confusion. Victims would likely attribute this to excessive food and alcohol consumption common at such feasts. But the symptoms would escalate through the night: violent vomiting, convulsions, racing pulse, difficulty breathing. By morning, the true crisis would be obvious. And over the following 3 days, organ failure would progress inexorably toward death. Marcus had engineered the poison mixture so that victims would remain conscious through much of their suffering. He wanted them to know they were dying. He wanted them to have time to fear, to understand, to experience even a fraction of the terror that enslaved people lived with every day. At 2 p.m., 5 hours before dinner service, Marcus began applying the poison basting sauce. He worked alone. He had sent his kitchen assistants away, claiming he needed absolute concentration for this crucial phase. He basted the pig carefully, applying the toxic sauce only to specific sections, the choice cuts that would be served to his 12 targets. The beauty of his plan was in the details. A whole roasted pig was traditionally carved at the table by the host, with different sections going to different guests based on social hierarchy. Master Edwin always took meat from the shoulder, his favorite cut. Catherine preferred the tenderloin. Edmund liked the ribs. The overseers and drivers typically received sections from the legs. And guests of honor, like Colonel Middleton, Henry Ravenel, Dr. Pringle, and James Rutherford, would be offered choice cuts from various portions. Marcus had mapped out exactly which sections of the pig would be carved for which guests, based on 18 years of observing social protocols at Blackwater dinners. He applied his poison only to those specific sections, leaving other portions untreated so that women, children, and lower status guests would consume safe meat. The ethical calculation here is worth noting. Some might ask, how could Marcus be sure only his intended targets would consume the poison portions? The answer is that he couldn't be absolutely certain, but he had observed enough formal dinners to make highly accurate predictions, and he had made a cold decision. Collateral damage, while regrettable, was acceptable given the magnitude of his justified revenge. At 6 p.m., guests began gathering in the grand dining room. The table had been set with the Blackwaters' finest china, crystal, and silver. Candles blazed in chandeliers. Enslaved servants moved silently through the room, pouring wine and bourbon, bringing out appetizers that Marcus had prepared earlier: oysters, shrimp, cheese, crackers. The first courses came out at 6:30 p.m. Turtle soup, then salad, then fish. Marcus had prepared all of these without poison. This was genuine fine dining, establishing the meal's excellence before the main event. At 7:45 p.m., right on schedule, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts of fire, fire in the tobacco barn. Isaac had fulfilled his part of the plan perfectly. Master Edwin and several guests rushed outside to assess the situation. Vincent Cross and the drivers ran toward the barn. For 15 minutes, attention was completely diverted from the kitchen. During those 15 minutes, Marcus made his final preparations. He removed the pig from the spit, placed it on an enormous silver platter decorated with apples, oranges, and fresh herbs. He studied his work. The skin was perfectly golden brown, crispy, glistening with the basting sauce that contained death itself. The aroma was extraordinary, making his own mouth water, despite knowing what the meat contained. This was his masterpiece, the culmination of 18 years of skill, enhanced by 8 months of meticulous planning, transformed into an instrument of vengeance. The fire was quickly extinguished. It had been small, as planned, just enough to create the necessary distraction. Guests returned to the dining room, laughing about the excitement, praising the quick response. They had no idea what had just happened in the kitchen. At 8:00 p.m., Marcus entered the dining room carrying the massive platter. The pig's entrance was met with applause and exclamations of admiration. Even by Charleston County standards, this was an impressive presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Master Edwin announced, standing at the head of the table with carving knife and fork in hand, "may I present the finest pig ever roasted in South Carolina, prepared by my exceptional cook, Marcus. Marcus, come here and receive the praise you deserve." Marcus approached, bowing his head with apparent modesty. Guests offered compliments. Catherine actually smiled at him, a rare occurrence. Edmund raised his bourbon glass in salute. Colonel Middleton declared he had never seen a more beautiful roasted pig. James Rutherford licked his lips in anticipation. "Thank you, Master," Marcus said quietly. "I hope it pleases everyone." "I'm certain it will exceed all expectations," Edwin said. He began carving with ceremonial flourish. Marcus watched with satisfaction as each poisoned portion went to exactly the intended recipient. Edwin carved himself a generous slice of shoulder, poisoned. He served Catherine a portion of tenderloin, poisoned. Edmund received ribs, poisoned. Vincent Cross got leg meat, poisoned. The 4 drivers received their sections, all poisoned. Colonel Middleton was honored with a prime cut from the loin, poisoned. Henry Ravenel received shoulder meat, poisoned. Dr. Pringle got a portion from the leg, poisoned. And James Rutherford was served an especially generous helping, befitting a valued business associate, thoroughly poisoned. The section served to women, children, and other guests came from the untreated portions. Marcus had calculated everything perfectly. "Marcus, will you not join us?" Master Edwin asked in a rare gesture of magnanimity prompted by excellent bourbon and social performance. "Take a portion for yourself as reward for this magnificent preparation." "Thank you, Master. You're too kind." Marcus carved himself a small portion from an untreated section and retired to eat in the kitchen, as was proper for a slave. He sat alone in his kitchen and ate his portion of the pig. The meat was genuinely excellent, tender, flavorful, perfectly cooked. For a moment, he allowed himself to take pride in his craftsmanship. Then he thought of Sarah working in Alabama cotton fields, of Grace's bleeding hands, of Thomas carrying water in brutal heat, and his pride transformed into cold satisfaction. In the dining room, his targets were consuming their final meal. The dinner continued for another 2 hours. More courses came out. Sweet potatoes, green beans, rice, cornbread, desserts. Wine and bourbon flowed freely. Conversations grew louder, laughter more raucous. It was a spectacular success, the kind of dinner that would be discussed in Charleston society for months. By 10:30 p.m., guests were beginning to retire. Some were staying overnight in the main house or guest quarters. Others were departing for their own plantations, with enslaved drivers guiding carriages through the darkness. Marcus cleaned his kitchen with unusual care, washing every pot and pan, disposing of the poisoned basting sauce in the woods where it would never be found, burning the notes he had made about dosages and timing. He left no evidence except the results that would begin manifesting in a few hours. At midnight, he returned to his empty cabin and waited. The first symptoms appeared around 2 a.m. Master Edwin woke with severe nausea, stumbled to his chamber pot, and vomited violently. He assumed he had simply overindulged in food and drink, common enough after such feasts. He tried to return to sleep. Catherine woke 30 minutes later with the same symptoms, plus dizziness and a racing heartbeat. She called for her maid, demanded tea and crackers, complained about the rich food. By 3 a.m., Edmund was vomiting uncontrollably. Vincent Cross was experiencing muscle spasms in his quarters. The 4 drivers were all ill in their cabins. Colonel Middleton had departed for his plantation, but his carriage returned at 4 a.m. because he had collapsed on the road, unable to continue. Henry Ravenel never made it home. His driver had to turn back after Ravenel suffered a seizure in the carriage. Dr. Pringle, ironically, recognized that something was seriously wrong and tried to purge his system with ipecac, but it was far too late, and James Rutherford, the slave trader, woke in his guest room convinced he was having a heart attack. By dawn on September 28th, the plantation was in chaos. 12 men were seriously ill, with symptoms escalating from mere food poisoning to something obviously more severe. Enslaved nurses ran between bedrooms trying to provide care. Other guests, those who had not eaten the poisoned pork, wondered if they too would fall ill. Dr. Pringle, despite his own suffering, tried to diagnose the problem. He suspected poison almost immediately. The symptoms were too severe, too consistent across multiple victims to be natural food contamination. But what poison? And how had it been administered? Suspicion fell on the pig, the centerpiece of the meal, the dish that all the sick men had consumed. But many people had eaten the pig without becoming ill. How could some portions be poisoned while others weren't? Master Edwin, between bouts of vomiting and increasingly confused by the belladonna affecting his mind, called for Marcus. "Bring the cook here, now." Marcus was brought to Edwin's bedroom, where the master lay on sweat-soaked sheets, his face gray, his hands trembling. Catherine was in the next room, screaming in delirium. Edmund was downstairs having convulsions on the parlor floor. The sounds of suffering filled the grand house. "Did you poison us?" Edwin asked, his voice weak but carrying accusation. Marcus looked at the man who had owned him for 33 years, who had sold his family, who had ordered him whipped for begging for mercy. He looked at Edwin Blackwater dying in his expensive bed, surrounded by luxury built on stolen labor, and he felt no pity whatsoever. "Yes, master," Marcus said calmly. "I poisoned you. I poisoned everyone who took my family from me. Everyone who beat us, raped us, sold us, worked us to death. I poisoned you all, and I'm not sorry." Edwin tried to rise from the bed, perhaps intending violence, but his body wouldn't obey. The poisons were destroying his nervous system, his heart, his organs. He collapsed back onto the pillows. "Why?" he whispered. "You were treated well. You had privileges. You were valued." "You sold my wife and children to pay your gambling debts," Marcus said. "You took everything I loved, and you called it business. You whipped me for begging you not to, and then you forgot about it because to you, breaking up my family was nothing, just property management, just mathematics." "They were my property," Edwin gasped. "I had every right." "No," Marcus interrupted. "You had no right. No man has the right to own another man. No man has the right to sell children. And when you take everything from someone, when you leave them nothing to lose, you create something dangerous. You created me." "They'll hang you," Edwin said. "They'll torture you first." "I know. But you'll be dead before me. You'll die in your own vomit, and excrement in agony over 3 days, just long enough to understand what's happening. And every other slave owner in South Carolina will hear about what I did and wonder if their trusted cook, their valued craftsman, their loyal servant, is planning the same thing. Marcus turned and walked out of the bedroom. Armed men were waiting to arrest him, but he didn't resist. He had accomplished what he set out to do. Now came the consequences he had always known would follow. Over the next 3 days, Marcus sat in the plantation jail and listened to the sounds of men dying. Edwin Blackwater died on September 30th after 2 days of agony. His final words, a gurgling scream as his organs failed. Catherine survived 1 day longer, dying on October 1st, her last hours spent in complete delirium, believing she was a child again. Edmund died on September 30th as well, his young body ravaged by the poisons. Vincent Cross lasted until October 1st. His legendary strength extended his suffering. The 4 drivers died on various days between September 30th and October 1st. Colonel Middleton died at his own plantation on September 29th. Henry Ravenel died on the road, never making it home. Dr. Pringle died on September 30th, despite his medical knowledge. And James Rutherford, the slave trader, died on October 1st, his last words a plea for water that no one would give him. 12 deaths, 12 agonizing exits from the world, 12 fewer slaveholders in South Carolina. The trial took place on October 15th in Charleston. It was pure theater. Marcus had confessed, never denied his actions, but the law required formal proceedings. They appointed him a lawyer who clearly wanted nothing to do with defending a slave who had poisoned 12 white men. The verdict was predetermined, guilty on 12 counts of murder. Sentence, death by hanging, to be carried out publicly. Before sentencing, they allowed Marcus to speak. He stood in the courtroom, surrounded by armed white men, facing a judge who had already decided his fate, and spoke with perfect clarity. I poisoned 12 men who represented everything evil about slavery, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed courthouse. Master Edwin sold my family for money. Catherine burned slaves with hot irons for amusement. Edmund raped women because he could. Vincent Cross delivered thousands of lashes for profit. The drivers collaborated in oppressing their own people. The slave trader built his fortune destroying families, and the guests practiced their own cruelties on their own plantations. Silence him, someone shouted, but the judge allowed him to continue. You can hang me, Marcus said. You can make my death as painful and public as you want, but you can't undo what I did. 12 men are dead, and every slave in South Carolina will know that Marcus Wellington, a cook, poisoned his masters and went to his death without apology. They'll know we're not helpless. They'll know we can fight back. The courtroom erupted in shouting, but Marcus's words had landed. They would spread through slave quarters, would become part of oral tradition, would inspire resistance for generations. They scheduled his hanging for November 1st, 1847. They built a gallows in Charleston's main square, mandating that every slave within 30 miles be brought to witness the execution. The day arrived cold and gray. Over 3,000 people gathered. White people to see justice served. Enslaved people forced to watch their would-be rebellion crushed. Armed militia surrounded the crowd, ready to suppress any disturbance. Marcus was led to the gallows in chains, wearing the same blood-stained clothes from the feast. He walked with his head high, his spine straight, his eyes clear. They positioned him on the platform, placed the noose around his neck. A preacher offered to pray for his soul. Marcus declined. My mother taught me that the Creator judges hearts, not laws. My heart is at peace. The sheriff asked if he had final words. Marcus looked out at the crowd, particularly at the enslaved, people forced to watch, and spoke directly to them. My name is Marcus Wellington. I was born free in Africa. I was stolen, enslaved, brought here in chains. I spent 33 years as property. I loved my wife and children with everything I had. When they were taken from me, I struck back. I killed 12 white men who thought they were untouchable, and I'd do it again." The hangman pulled the lever. Marcus fell through the trapdoor. The rope snapped taut. His neck broke cleanly. A quick death, quicker than he had given his victims, quicker than he probably deserved in some moral calculus, but death nonetheless. They left his body hanging for 2 days as a warning. Then they cut it down and buried it in an unmarked grave outside Charleston. But they couldn't bury his legacy. Within months, slave resistance increased across South Carolina. Small acts of sabotage multiplied. Tools broken, crops damaged, overseers found dead in accidents. Plantation owners hired more security, instituted harsher punishments, but none of it restored their sense of absolute control. The story of the Charleston poisoning spread throughout the South. It reached Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, Alabama, where Sarah, Grace, and Thomas heard about it and understood that Marcus had loved them enough to burn the world down when they were taken. Abolitionists in the North used the story in their propaganda, pointing to Marcus Wellington as evidence that slavery created the very violence that slaveholders feared. Frederick Douglass mentioned it in speeches. Harriet Tubman told escaping slaves about the cook who poisoned 12 masters. The spiritual sung in slave quarters gained new verses. Marcus made the masters feast, 12 men dead, from first to least, poison served on silver plate. Justice came, though it came late. Marcus Wellington's story is America's story, the parts textbooks don't teach. He was not a hero in the simple sense. He was a murderer who killed 12 people. But context matters. Motive matters. The system that created Marcus Wellington bears responsibility for what he became. His name deserves to be remembered alongside Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, and other enslaved people who refused to accept their bondage. His story proves that resistance took many forms, that the enslaved were never passive, that brilliance and agency persisted even under brutal oppression. Today, over 175 years later, we remember Marcus Wellington. We remember his family torn apart by greed. We remember the 12 men he killed. And we remember that freedom was never given. It was always taken, fought for, died for.